Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Vestanland. This is episode 31, and in this episode, I'm building a custom multi-level transit hub right next to the airport. It's going to feature the regional rail, the metro, and the monorail system that's kind of transports passengers between terminals. I'd set up the infrastructure for this build over the past couple episodes, and it's pretty cool to kind of actually put it to use. As you can see, I kind of have like the ends of the rail network ready to go into this area. Then I had sort of placed down the metro station as a placeholder. I'm using the free-to-place metro stations from Kloos as a part of that Berlin metro pack that I've been using. You'll see the actual station for the metro is obviously underground. I don't actually spend any time detailing that, but what I do end up doing with the metro is creating a metro yard here. And I'm doing that because I'm imagining it's going to be the end of one of the metro lines. It's like a terminus station, and I thought it made sense to kind of integrate a maintenance and storage facility into that. And in order to do that, first I looked at Google Maps, and to get some inspiration, I've seen that this is kind of it's a pretty common way for lines to terminate is at an airport like this, or out kind of, it makes sense because their airports are away from the city and they're a little bit more industrial, but they're also big trip generators, so it makes sense for a line to terminate here. And I'm basing this off of, in particular, the terminus station at Chicago Midway Airport. This is a little bit different because I wanted to have the station underground, one to use the free-to-place metro stations I was talking about, and also because I wanted to have the regional rail station here as the above-ground station, and I wanted to focus more on detailing that. Speaking of the regional rail, as you can see, I'm kind of extending this out, and I thought this shape looks pretty interesting, how it kind of curves towards the terminal, then it kind of curves away, goes over the highway, and then parallels it for a little while. You can see I'm using the network multi-tool mod, a couple of its different functions to get this looking right. I use the parallel mode to put in this retaining wall to kind of separate it from the highway a little bit more realistically. And then I also use the slope function to get both of these networks looking right. And I like how this kind of slopes away into the, just towards ground level, and then kind of sets up the, possibility of having some kind of town or development further out on this island along that rail line in the future. I'm again using the network multi-tool here to put in this fence to kind of mark off the area for the airport a little bit more clearly. There's definitely a lot more that I could do in terms of adding like cargo functionality and just kind of general industry in this area that I don't really get to. That may be a little bit further down the line because there's a few other projects I want to get to before I do that. Speaking of kind of industrial areas, I'm building the metro yard that I had talked about. I like how I have this kind of curved loop, kind of like the metro tracks kind of double back on themselves, and then they kind of terminate. And I sort of played around with the layout of this a little bit. I started out having it kind of paralleling the highway and then terminating in a couple different tracks here. They're all sort of parallel to each other. I also did a lot of work with the node controller to kind of stretch out these different connections to make them look as realistic as possible. Obviously, I've been using the Kloos Metro or Berlin Metro pack rather. And obviously it's a great collection of assets. The one limitation of it is that there aren't any one-way tracks, which would be, I imagine, useful for this situation. I imagine there'd be a lot of kind of one-way connections in a rail yard like this, but I'm sort of making do with just the two-way tracks. I think it looks all right. And yeah, you can see when I sort of stretch out these nodes and kind of make them sort of all mirror each other and make the connections look a little more realistic, kind of really comes together. It's a good backdrop for the rest of the build. And you'll see at the end of the episode, I do a little bit of detailing in terms of like placing down some parked trains. And I will discuss that a little bit more when I get to it. As far as the main build of the station here, I I started out by placing down these kind of concrete platforms that are kind of just hovering in midair at the moment, kind of using them as a canvas almost, as sort of like a blank slate to like kind of place down props and networks and stuff like that. Um, you'll see I do a lot of work to get all of the pedestrian path connections lined up and placing down these platforms. Um, Really not platforms per se, but actually just concrete surfaces. It's really important for that process. I want to get them lined up perfectly. Um, and yeah, another thing I'm doing here, you can see I'm using the adaptive networks mod to get those monorail tracks looking a little more detail without much effort, which is always nice. I'm also adding in a little bit of concrete, changing some of the. I initially had put the railroad tracks in. It's just the sort of elevated, undetailed versions. I switched them to the bridges. Again, that just doing little things to add detail without much effort is always important. And now I'm getting to kind of the meat of the detailing here. Adding these platforms. These are the same from the same pack of modern station platforms that I've been using in train stations, kind of all across this series. You can see I converted these to procedural objects to give myself a little bit more flexibility and control with where I was placing them. That's definitely a big asset for a build like this, especially when I'm dealing with major height differences. You can see I've got the monorail also coming in here. Wanted to test out the functionality of that. And once I sort of had confirmed that that was working the way I wanted it to, I used the same kind of strategy here to add platforms for the monorail station, making sure there was enough clearance between the train and the platform. And then, yeah, once that's set up, I can move on to adding more details. And you can see right now what I'm doing is extending this platform over the rail tracks to allow for pedestrians to walk sort of from one side of the railway station and then go up and over to the monorail station. And you can see here I'm using these are the same concrete pedestrian paths that I've used in a lot of different builds. They're super nice because you can use them at the elevated version and then just kind of like move them around without having to worry about the different, the terrain being pulled in different directions. So I used these paths to kind of make sure pedestrians could access all different levels of the station. Obviously, that's important to get this sort of in place first. Especially when I'm considering that I'm dealing with the three different stations effectively. And yeah, so I actually don't think I actually show it in this video, but I've done it before where I use the pedestrian tour functionality just from the base game to kind of test out whether or not the pedestrian connections are working. And again, I do that off camera here because I've done it before and I've talked about it. But yeah, I confirmed that all of these connections are working and people will be able to access all different levels of the station. Once I had that done, I decided to go ahead and kind of encase this train station kind of as a box. I started out by using these kind of just like brick walls here as a placeholder. I didn't really think that these fit super well with the style I was going for. I ended up deciding to go with this with the grass on top here. I thought this was kind of a cool touch here. I imagine that there's going to be this is kind of a nice place. Maybe if people are, just kind of, again, I sort of talked about how airports are pretty industrial and pretty grimy sometimes. So I thought adding sort of a touch of greenery on the station was nice. I imagine if people are sort of walking through here, even if they're not staying long, kind of having a little bit, maybe there's a few plants and stuff like that, would be a nice touch for making the station experience a little bit more positive. Now I'm moving on to adding kind of the maintenance facility that I've talked about. I noticed a lot of these kind of rail yards for metro and trains of all kinds. They have kind of obviously the like sort of bunch of tracks where trains can be stored, but then they also have something like this, some kind of shed where trains can be worked on. I obviously don't know exactly what goes on in there, but I'm imagining trains can kind of just pull in. You'll see I'll add kind of a fake door. And I also kind of, just to add a little bit more interest, I kind of shift these other tracks a little bit off to the side to kind of allow for there to be a little bit more space for different maintenance vehicles to pass through here. I use the Revo train depot doors here just to kind of create the illusion that there's space behind this building. Obviously, you can't actually like go in there and see anything, but having these doors here where the trains could go and yeah, be worked on, repaired, or what have you. This is a nice touch, I think, and I really like how the I didn't really talk about earlier, but I like how I spliced in some of these industrial buildings into kind of station structure. It kind of broke up some of the sort of the kind of like monolithic look of the station, which I didn't like. And yeah, having these sort of buildings spliced in there really helps with that. Another thing I do is I add this kind of service road going under the station, and I imagine that this is obviously where vehicles would access the maintenance facility. This also might be a way that vehicles can make deliveries to the airport. Obviously there's a lot of sort of auxiliary businesses that operate within the airport, all the restaurants and shops and stuff. So yeah, I imagine at some point in the future, I'm going to do an episode or part of an episode with kind of like adding some more modern developments around here. I imagine a couple hotels and offices and stuff like that. And then that episode will be a time to kind of flesh out this connection here. You can see I kind of just placed down this road is a bit of a placeholder, having it going under the highway. I didn't really do much to detail it or make sure it looks as realistic as possible. Again, because that's not really the focus of this episode. But I did want to have this road here again to kind of break up the sheer wall there. I added a few of the same depot doors, and then I added these sheet metal props to kind of change the texture of the wall, make it look a little bit more like a building as opposed to just the retaining wall that I have there right now. And I like how this texture turns out. It kind of gives it look like a sort of a warehouse looking vibe, but then it's sort of a nice contrast between that and again the kind of green roof on the station, which again is something I sort of just kind of stumbled into when I was playing around with the different options for retaining walls that I had. But I'm really happy with how it turned out. Now moving on to the station itself and adding sort of getting into a little bit more of the detailing, and I started out by putting some asphalt surface networks down. I decided to change those to procedural objects a little bit later on. But one of the most important things I did was use these sort of escalator stair combination props. Obviously these aren't functional, they're just props, but it gives me a place to put the pedestrian paths and also line up some of those prop doors again, or prop sort of just like black sort of voids almost. And this I think is what really gives this station its realism. Adding these you can sort of see into the levels. I had not done this when I did the main train station build a couple months ago. I just placed down some escalators, but I didn't really work with any of the height differences like I'm doing here. And I think this is a really big help in terms of making this realistic, as I said before. You can see now I'm sort of shifting these nodes around for the different pedestrian paths, getting them in place. And yeah, again, I'm using that pedestrian tour function to kind of make sure that people could access the station from both sides, from the airport and all that. Is what I did here to make sure that those paths were lined up correctly. As you can see, this is where I added the procedural object ploppable asphalt down. Again, I wanted to kind of mix up the different surfaces. I like how there's kind of the platforms obviously right around the trains, but then there's the green roof, and then the asphalt texture kind of mixes things up. And yeah, it also allowed me to easily move around this opening for the stairs and escalators, which again, I think is probably the most important piece of detailing that I did in terms of realism. And yeah, once I sort of had that down, I was able to put down this kind of station shelter network by Ronix, I'm pretty sure, which I've used in various forms in other parts of the city. Initially, I wasn't sure about putting this down because it kind of blocked a little bit of the work I had done. I think it's a little bit more realistic, and it's not too bad. You'll see right now I have the one with no openings in the roof, but I added one with some glass, kind of skylight type things. So that makes it look a little more interesting. And yeah, I'm also adding the same stairs and escalators to go from the train station level up to the monorail. Again, doing the same work with the pedestrian paths to get them all lined up. Adding some nodes in the middle to add a little bit more extra flexibility and functionality. And then this is kind of a little bit of a placeholder, but I added this kind of a truss network. This is an asset that's designed for placing down like highway signs, but I kind of added it here, sort of to add a little bit of an industrial look to it, kind of exposing the like the support mechanism, and then also using again with procedural objects, making this concrete platform basically as thin as possible to maximize the clearance for the trains underneath. And then when I sort of realized I had to do that, I figured I should probably add some kind of extra support in the form of those trusses. It kind of doesn't, I don't know, they're obviously not designed for a building like this, but I think it looks a little bit better than just having the concrete kind of just floating in the air. And yeah, I'm also, as you can see, I'm putting down these this asphalt kind of just as I go, covering up the different holes in the station structure. And you can see another thing I kind of glossed over a little bit is that the stair props that I'm using and they're a little bit shorter than the difference in height between the monorail and the rail line. I could have moved the monorail down a little bit, but I decided to keep it like that and kind of you'll see a little bit later, add some stairs and kind of a sloped entrance to the monorail station. I also use the same platforms on the monorail station as the train station, which might not be the most realistic, but I think it's okay in this situation. Again, I use procedural objects to make these platforms as narrow as I could. Basically not narrow, but less deep, so that it didn't interfere with the train station below. You can see I'm also, so this is what I'm doing here with adding you can kind of see a little bit now how the changes in elevation of this monorail station are kind of a little bit difficult to work with. I'm using the same concrete surface to kind of frame where I want the different parts of this structure to exist. And then I'm using another one, and then kind of just you'll see I'll kind of just rotate it and kind of line it up in the middle here so that there's easy access for people from the escalators and the stairs up to the monorail station. One thing I realized I did not end up adding, but I easily could, would be to add some elevators on kind of between the escalator and stair areas there. I think that would add a little bit more realism. I think that's probably what you would see, especially when there's like 3 levels of the station. I imagine there would be some kind of elevator to help facilitate people transferring between the different levels. Another thing I added in terms of sort of back on the theme of adding supports to this massive platform was these pillars, which kind of take the place of the kind of flimsy looking trusses. And I ended up keeping the truss networks in place, but I had them kind of spanning between the different pillars that I added. And you can't really see them at the bottom anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. Again, I'm another asset that I've used a lot in previous builds, but I'm using again here is this prefabricated concrete wall. It's from a prefabricated house pack, but it's another asset that's super useful with procedural objects in terms of just customizing the size and using it to frame different areas of a completely custom building like this. Again, another place where I'm using procedural objects is on these stairs. I kind of like how it turns out with having the sloped middle section and then having stairs on either side. Obviously, these stairs are kind of they're a sort of a stone, which is not the most modern looking thing, but I think it looks kind of cool. It's kind of an interesting contrast between the kind of super modern, like almost brutalist looking, like kind of concrete surfaces of the station, and then they also put in a little bit of stone to make it look a little more classy, I guess. I don't know, but yeah, I think having different surfaces like this, having weird kind of juxtapositions of different things is helpful in a build like this. And yeah, using obviously procedural objects was a game changer in this build. Just being able to copy over these props that I completely distorted and messed up and made them look all wonky from different angles. Um, yeah, super helpful to be able to just slide them, copy them, and slide them into place with procedural objects. Again, using the prefab house wall prop to frame this upper level, adding kind of a little bit of an edge to this station here. Again, also using it to frame the sort of cutouts for the elevators and the stairs. What I'm able to do with this upper level here, again, first I connect up the paths, use the node controller to like shift everything into position. You'll see I use these walls to kind of put down a little bit of like, when I added the roof and like some like supports and windows and stuff, I kind of use those walls as a baseline. But again, I wanted to add all of the details that I was going to put in to this area, this upper level, before I added any kind of roof. And you see, I kind of mentioned this when I was talking about the station shelter network that I placed down on the lower level. I sort of felt weird about putting in a ton of detail and then kind of just covering it up. And while I was kind of deciding how to best deal with that, I moved back down a level to the train station, and added a few custom props and stuff on the side that's sort of like, just adjacent to the terminal here. First off, adding some doors to kind of make it seem feasible for people to just walk straight into the terminal from here. I'm not really sure. Obviously, you can kind of see inside this terminal building a little bit, and there are like some details of shops and stairways and stuff like that. I didn't really spend any time actually going in there just because I didn't really know how to make it look realistic. And again, it's not really something I'd be able to see almost ever. So I focused my detailing on the outside of the station, adding the same sort of set of benches and lamps and stuff like that on the edges of the platforms here. You'll see a little bit later on, I use the same, like the procedural objects text customization function to add some custom signs. And yeah, again, that's another thing that really adds to the continuity. I'm doing it right here. Adding this station, just labeling it as Nyrstad International Airport. I imagine this is going to be a pretty busy station on this line. I think I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I think I'm going to do an episode on just getting all of the transit lines sort of functioning and named and all that stuff, and adding kind of all the necessary infrastructure around it. And then going back to the sign, I use this. I'm not sure what this asset is, but it's like a pole type thing, and I use procedural objects to like make it a lot wider and taller, and have it so it supports this sort of two-sided sign here, and it kind of integrates into the that glass fence that I placed down. And then I kind of just copied those procedural objects, modified props, and then kind of shifted them into place, so it was kind of to give a unified look to the station. Another thing I'm doing is adding a few tables and chairs on that grassy area. I feel like a lot of times in places like this, it's kind of nice to have a place to sit, place for people to kind of just like take a break, take a breather from a hectic travel day, maybe. Adding a little bit of not a ton there. I mean, again, this is a transit station. People are probably going to be generally moving through here pretty quickly. I think it's important to make it look a little bit more inviting. And I think that kind of grassy area that I was talking about, and then adding a few props there sort of helps with that. I'm now using these glowing signs. I can't remember who makes them on the workshop. But again, they're designed for airports and to be used with procedural objects. And this is another thing that I think probably could use a little bit more work in terms of just the story behind this area. Obviously, I have on the sign here just all terminals, are this way, like through the doors. I definitely could do more work with adding signs, and adding figuring out exactly what the different terminals are called. There's definitely a little bit more work to do there. I'm not really sure exactly. Again, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. This is where I'm adding these signs for the monorail station. I'm labeling this side as the international terminal, which I think makes sense. It looks a little bit more modern, a little bit newer, maybe. And maybe we're saying the other side is more, I guess, domestic flights partially. I mean, obviously, this is a very small country, the country of Vestanland. So most flights are probably going to be international. But I imagine, if there were domestic flights, they'd be on the other side of the airport, closer to where the road and highway connections are. And yeah, anyway, that's enough speculation. Back to what I'm doing on screen here. This is what I was talking about in terms of encasing this upper level and kind of making it kind of its own building. I use the same glass and like steel props here, converted to procedural objects to form the walls of this structure. And then I used the same building that I'm using for the terminal and then converted to procedural objects to isolate the roof of it. And then using PO to basically just get rid of all the vertices except for the roof, and then kind of using the godsend that is procedural objects to shift it up and shift it directly into place. And this, I think, really ties everything together, having the roofs kind of mesh the way they end up doing here. I also used another concrete pillar to kind of, again, the one weird thing, I kind of mentioned this, I used the same technique on the stadium roof from a couple episodes ago. But these props here, they kind of do weird things when they like interact with each other, especially at the corners. So I just used that concrete pillar to kind of hide that. And then, yeah, like I was mentioning before, using procedural objects to modify this roof to kind of integrate it with the existing one. I think that's what really makes this airport transit hub come together. I also added, again, I kept this one side of the upper level open. And honestly, that's mainly just because I couldn't get the glass. It was like not looking very realistic on that side for whatever reason. But also gives me an excuse to have more of an open air look to it, which is helpful for the cinematics at the end of the episode. For the last part of the episode, I'm moving back down to ground level and kind of finishing the sort of maintenance storage facility for the metro line. Again, I'm starting out by adding this retaining wall, which I think really does a good job of framing the area of this episode. And yeah, kind of like, I sort of mentioned this at the beginning, but I really like how the curve of the metro line, it's kind of symmetrical when you're looking at it from above, but then if you look at it from like in profile, it kind of is a pretty steep slope. Not so steep that it's unrealistic, but I don't know, I think that's a really interesting contrast. And then when I add this sort of big like collection of trees off to the side, kind of framing the, I guess I'm not gonna do it right now, my bad. But yeah, at first, I guess I add the fence to kind of separate the highway from the maintenance facility. And then eventually I'm going to add some trees and stuff like that. First, I want to go through and add a few more stains just to kind of rough up the surface in this area. Again, I want it to look kind of worn and kind of dingy a little bit, adding a few of these really nice ground cover assets. Kind of, again, mix things up and kind of add a little bit more texture to the area. And also in terms of realism, having I imagine this maintenance facility is they probably don't want big trees like, falling and messing things up. But then, as you can see here, I am adding the trees on this side, kind of framing the highway and the rail line, which I think looks really cool. Another thing I'm doing is just kind of, again, I sort of mentioned this kind of placeholder road here a little bit earlier. And I don't really do any detailing with the road, and you'll see in the cinematics, if you look at the lower level, it sort of looks a little bit unfinished. That's mainly just because I didn't really know what to do in this area. I know I wanted to have these retaining walls kind of separating things, and I think they sort of do a good job of framing what I was able to build here. And again, using the concrete surfaces to kind of like sort of block off exactly what I had done, and then sort of have that placeholder road left for a future time. This is the last thing I do. I mentioned this at the very beginning. I add these prop metro trains, which I think really complete the look of this area. These are, I believe, the Sydney metro trains, which I think they're some of the best assets I found on the workshop for this exact purpose. And yeah, I guess these will be the trains that I use on the metro lines in that future episode, whenever it is. Maybe the next one, maybe a little bit later. I don't know. But yeah, again, I think it makes sense to have one consistent look for the trains that are running on the tracks and they're parked in the storage facilities. But yeah, anyway, this is the end of the video. I want to thank you guys so much again for watching. Feel free to check out the links below. And hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye.